Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for a discussion about walking the talk in patient engagement. I'm Susan Schaefer. I'm the founding president and CEO of the Patients Academy for Research Advocacy, which is a nonprofit that I've started to help build a community of patients and carers who are better able to influence medical research to be patient-centered and relevant and useful through a program of education and training about the processes and stakeholders involved in drug development. I decided to focus on patient-centered development following 6 years as the head editor of the biopharmaceutical industry publication BioCentury, where it was my job to serve an audience of industry executives and academic researchers, investors, regulators, and policymakers with identification and analysis of trends and advancing new thinking that could really improve the development and delivery of new treatments to patients. In that time, patient-centered R&D has been one of the most important trends that I followed and that we followed in the publication. It is clear that every phase of product development and care delivery could be improved by a more active and thoughtful approach to patient engagement. Because living with a medical condition provides a unique experience, and I would argue a necessary expertise that should be brought to bear throughout the product life cycle and to healthcare delivery. If patients and caregivers were routinely engaged as partners to help guide the development of product profiles and clinical endpoints and trial protocols and approval and reimbursement parameters, we'd have better products, we'd have better health, we'd have better value, and we'd have less waste of time and money and other resources. Healthcare players throughout the system have made progress toward this goal, and a lot of it, particularly in the last 6 years. There is now a general agreement among industry and regulators, legislators, and patients and patient advocacy organizations that patient engagement is, in fact, the right thing to do. And we're pretty well aligned on the goal, which is to develop medical products that meet patients' needs and are delivered in a way that benefits individual patients and public health on the whole. And evidence of this agreement is everywhere. Patients have had an increasing role in shaping the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, under which FDA receives funding in return for commitments to innovations and changes in the way that it reviews drugs. The last two negotiations to reauthorize the act, known as PDUFA, in 2012 and 2017, patients were at the table when those deals were being shaped. And as part of the negotiations, FDA made explicit commitments to seek input from patients and develop methods and practices to more comprehensively integrate their perspectives into regulatory decisions. In addition to the PDUFA negotiations, the 21st Century Cures Act committed the agency to convene a series of workshops to obtain public input on various aspects of patient-focused drug development, and to roll out a series of guidances aimed at creating a roadmap for making patient experience data integral to every phase of medical product development. Within industry, we saw the first chief patient officer role created in 2014. And since then, many biopharmaceutical companies have created similar roles and either created, built or reorganized teams to advance patient-centered practices throughout their organizations. And also during this time, we've seen patient organizations undertaking increasingly ambitious roles in not only funding, but conducting research, from basic research to the design and conduct of large, complex platform clinical trials, such as the COMPASS study being run by the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. Patients have also helped to reshape drug regulation, for example, through the breakthrough therapy pathway that was first conceived of by Friends of Cancer Research. As another example, through an FDA guidance on developing drugs for Duchenne muscular dystrophy that was initially drafted by Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. Even so, there remains a lot of work to do to ensure that organizations are walking the talk of patient engagement. And much of the time, it still seems that patient engagement is easier said than done. This panel, which includes leaders from multiple segments of the healthcare system, will walk us through the ways their organizations are structuring themselves to ensure adoption and advancement of patient-centered practices. We're going to talk about when and how patients can be engaged and how different stakeholders are deriving value from engagement. We will also discuss real-life roadblocks to systemic patient engagement and how to overcome them. And we will discuss what it will take to continue to prioritize patient engagement and drive toward more objective, data-driven methods for interpreting and acting upon the input that patients give us. We will take audience questions toward the end of our discussion, and at that time, we will have microphones passed through the audience so that we will be able to hear your questions as well as your answers. I will call on you individually and direct the microphones to you. And then at the end, we'll bring it back to the panel for the final word. So to get started, I'd like to introduce our panel and ask each of them why engaging patients is important to the work that you do. And I'm going to start at the far end with Julie Gerberding, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Patient Officer at Merck. Julie also was the first female director of the CDC and began her career as a physician in San Francisco just as the first cases of AIDS were occurring. Julie, during the AIDS epidemic, patient activists had a stunning impact on health policy, leading, for example, to the creation of the accelerated approval pathway. From that time to now, in your role as Chief Patient Officer at Merck, how has your perspective of patient engagement evolved, and how has it been important to your work in different ways?
Thank you. First of all, it's great to be here. I see a lot of friends in the audience, and I really feel honored to participate in the panel, so thank you. Right now, being the Chief Patient Officer, it feels like I've come full circle in my career, because in a sense, when I started as a young resident at UCSF at the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, I had to learn very quickly that our patients were our best teachers. I started in an era before there were medicines to treat the viral infection, and so we had to co-create with our patients decisions about how to manage their complications and most often how to prepare for a good death. And that's something that's very intimate and very personal. You develop a lot of insights. You learn to listen. You learn that you don't know best, that you need to really customize what you're doing and really take into consideration what the patient needs and wants. So those lessons from the very early days, I think, have really conditioned my whole belief system about patients ever since. So when I was given the chance to have this role at Merck, I was thrilled, because it was really just bringing that whole world back in focus for me. And what we do now really builds on those early lessons. In my world, I have 4 main priorities on behalf of our patients. One is to really continue that process of co-creation, the listening, the insights, the design of clinical trials, the inclusion for diversity in what we're trying to do. The second major area has to do, of course, with the patient experience with our company. What's it like to try to find information? Why do we have 96 different telephone numbers for people to call? There are a lot of just low-hanging fruit there that when we really looked at things from that lens, we realized we could do a much better job. The third area relates to the advocacy and the alliances, because who do we have more in common with than patients? We both want the same thing: affordable access to better drugs and medicines and cures. And the last is that affordable access piece, and that's something that I don't own because I'm not in the commercial organization at this point, but it's something that we all have to own and put front and center, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we invent. If people can't use it, it's not helpful. So it really is just coming back full circle, and it's a learning curve, I'll say that for sure.
No doubt. Next to Julie is Ivor Horn, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Accolade, a concierge health advocacy company that works directly with patients to help them better navigate their healthcare benefits. So, Ivor, I'm first going to ask you to explain what a concierge health advocacy company does. And tell us how Accolade prepares patients to effectively use the healthcare system to manage their own health, and why that's important.
Sure, thank you. So at Accolade, our role is to help patients navigate the healthcare system. We are hired by self-insured employers primarily to help their employees and their families navigate their health and benefits. And what we have are health assistants who are like lay health workers, as well as nurses and pharmacists and physicians on our team who help the patients understand what their health and benefits are at the right moment when they're in that situation, when they have that question. And at Accolade, the way that we do that and the way that we engage with them is we actually become the number on the back of the card. And our health assistants' task is not to answer a question about benefits and get the person off of the phone, but to really probe and understand. Whenever you call, you're calling because you're about to engage with the healthcare system. And when you're about to engage with the healthcare system, oftentimes that's a stressful situation, or it's a concern. You have a new diagnosis, you're about to go to the emergency room, and our health assistants are trained to solve that problem, to build that trusting relationship that they had a question about, but then to probe and understand more where their true need is, and then to begin that education process, and when needed, quickly get them to a nurse who can then coach them and help them prepare for that visit. And so we help them in those acute situations, and we help them with their chronic condition over a time period as well. And I'd have to say this is sort of, for me, coming full circle. I spent 20 years of my career focused on research in an academic setting. My research focused on patient engagement, patient-provider communication, and how my research could support and understand how we could create a more effective engagement in what I like to call that 7 minutes of fame that a patient gets with their provider. And what our research showed really was that there were two really key factors there. One was around trust and having a trust in that provider. And the second one was around self-efficacy and that patient's confidence that they could get out of that interaction what they needed to get out of that interaction. And what we do at Accolade every day is our health assistants start by building a longitudinal relationship, because once you engage with a health assistant, that health assistant becomes your person. If you call us back, you don't have to call the pool, you call your health assistant, Sally, and you engage with Sally, and you build a relationship. And they focus on building that trusting relationship. So that was the first piece. And then the second piece is that component around helping that member and helping that patient build that confidence so that when they're interacting with the healthcare system, they are well prepared and they feel confident in getting the outcome that they're seeking for that interaction. And so it's for me taking the research, the NIH-funded research that I did for many, many years and actually applying it, not just in the randomized controlled trial that I did, but now it serves at covering over 1.5 million people. And what's really important, and I'll talk about this because we talk about it sort of at the individual level and what that means on that individual engagement between a health assistant or a nurse and that patient. But we also talk about it in the system around how we create within our company the system process to make sure that that occurs at scale. And that we're getting those outcomes and those results, and that people are engaged and satisfied with their experience. But then also, how do we use technology to support that? One of the things that's really important about Accolade is It wasn't a technology company that is now adding on a human component. It was focused from the beginning on how to improve that human interaction and how to engage and how to get patients engaged in their care. And then the technology was built around that to support it.
And as a follow-up question, how do we all get access to your services?
We can, yes, we can talk about that later.
Next to Ivor is Kathy Hudson, who is the founding CEO of the People-Centered Research Foundation, a nonprofit organization that is focused on doing clinical research more effectively, efficiently, and ethically to deliver outcomes for patients and their families. And PCRF is partnering with and building upon the work of PCORnet and PCORI. Kathy, why is patient engagement important to achieving the mission of a distributed research network like PCORnet? And what is it that PCRF was founded to do to extend the work that was begun there?
So patient engagement and patient partnership is not just important for research in a distributed research network, but research across the board. And I would say that for far too long, research was designed and implemented by largely old white guys in white coats in rooms by themselves. And the first time a patient was engaged was when they were asked to sign an informed consent form. PCORI has really been a leader in trying to explore and experiment with approaches to how can we bring patients in at the beginning when research is being designed. So if ultimately we want to benefit the patients, it would be handy to know what the patients feel is important. And also in the design of a study, what kinds of designs make sense and what kinds don't. Does it make sense to require that patients show up for some sort of screening at 2 o'clock in the afternoon versus having weekend and evening hours? So we are at a really interesting inflection point where there has been now some research on what works in terms of patient partnership, but not a ton, frankly. So we're really in an evidence-free or limited evidence zone with respect to how do we partner with patients in research. I had the great honor of being involved in the genesis of the Precision Medicine All of Us research program, which had as its core principle patient partnership. It's not easy to do. I know we'll talk more about how hard it is to do, and Bray is certainly an expert and veteran there. But what's wonderful about PCORnet 2.0, which we are now in the process of forming and launching, is that we have networks of care providing organizations and institutions that take care of over 100 million patients. So if we do a study across 100 million patients and we embed in that research on how to do engagement, and more importantly, not just how to do engagement well, but what do you measure, right? If we're gonna transform how biomedical research is done, we have to prove that engaging patients at every step of the way actually benefits research and delivers cures faster. So that's what we really, that's the challenge that we're facing.
And Bray Patrick Lake is Director of Stakeholder Engagement at Duke Clinical Research Institute and a Senior Fellow at Faster Cures. And Bray, you've been doing a lot of work in investigating the value of engagement during research. Why does patient engagement drive high quality research? And what are the other metrics that you're looking at for judging what are we getting out of this?
Yeah, so I work at the Duke Clinical Research Institute, which is the world's largest academic research organization, large footprint on multi-site clinical trials across the US and also global medical trials. And you know, the slowdown and the waste of our finite research resources has a huge impact on everything that we're trying to do that's good for patients. And so DCRI really started to understand that patient engagement was critical to driving high quality research. And so first of all, we have this model from bench to bedside and back, from preclinical to post-market, And at the DCRI, we are committed to engaging early, often, and always. And the reason we do that is really under the principles of quality by design and a fit-for-purpose protocol that will actually achieve what the objectives were. And I think the approach that we usually saw was a focus on recruitment, and then, oh my gosh, if we got people in, retention. And if you didn't engage early, so, you might not have clear understanding of unmet need and therapeutic burden and risk and benefit perception from patients. All of these things really lead to, participant experience in a clinical trial and protocol amendments. So CITI, Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is an FDA public-private partnership, hosted by Duke University, created a metric. So first, there was a continuum of all the different touches that patients had in research. And so I hope all of you have seen this. It's the chevron model, multicolored. But if you take all of those activities, flip them on their side, and you look at them as levers that can then be pulled, all of those things lead to shortening of cycle times. We get endpoints that are more meaningful to patients. And hopefully we develop medical products that people will want to use. But those levers in pharmaceutical R&D map to the expected net present value model. And so it maps to risk, cost, time, intangibles, and certainly revenue if you're first to market. We know from the work of Ken Getz at Tufts Center of Study of Drug Development that the average phase 3 trial will have 4 amendments. Each amendment takes about 8 weeks to implement and costs about $500,000. And so aside from doing high quality, efficient research, there is this economic return of investment for engaging patients.
Absolutely. And to my right is Janet Woodcock, the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. And while FDA has long involved patients in the regulation of medical products through participation on advisory committees and various mechanisms for public comment and testimony, the agency began to visibly work on a much more systemic approach to patient-focused drug development with a series of town hall style meetings covering, I think, initially about 20 different diseases. I'd like to learn, what did you learn from those meetings, both about the patients who participated and in a much broader sense about how their input can enhance the regulation of medical products?
All right, well, first let me say a couple things. I'm really happy to be on this panel because I think you have a lot of the different sectors that need to be involved. Second of all, I'm a really serious and long-term critic of the research system in the United States.
Yes, she is.
And I really think that patient engagement is so needed because all the incentives are lined up with all the participants. And with patients not being participants, they don't get whatever they want into the whole system. But leaving that aside, to answer your question, all right? So Teresa Mullen and I came up with patient-focused drug development before the last PDUFA. So that would be about 7 years ago. We were negotiating PDUFA 6 or whichever one it is. And we proposed to industry that to better integrate patient input, that we have these meetings we call patient-focused drug development meetings. It would be disease-centered, and we'd have the people come in and they'd tell us about their condition, the burden of the disease, and the burden of current treatment, right. Okay, and what benefits they wanted alleviate, what burden they wanted alleviated, what was most important to them. And so we've had I think this has been just totally transformative. What we learned first is at least people with chronic diseases are the expert in their disease. Now, why should we be surprised about that? Okay, but actually, because if you only ask one patient or another, they're only going to have their individual. But when you actually get a lot of people together. They come together and talk about, the major things. Second of all, the medical system, the specialists who take care of that group of patients are really not fully clued into the burden of disease, or the burden of treatment, or the burden of trials, okay, or whatever you might. And one person said to me, one of our reviewers said, I sat across the desk with patients for the last 25 years, and she said, I never knew. So what they didn't know about, what she was talking about, was the suffering that people endure with their different conditions. So what we've learned, though, is, of course, we knew this already, is that this was an informal mechanism. We put out a report after it for everyone. We call it the voice of the patient, but it isn't a formal, generalizable, representative input, and that we needed some other ways to do that. But we learned the input is valuable. It has changed in a number of areas what we measure. It has changed how we think about drug development in that area and for regulation. So it's been extremely important, and I think possibly, though, the most important thing it's done, it's really energized the patient groups to realize they can have agency. Agency is so important, and that's something people feel, they felt, well, we'll give money to this famous researcher, that was the model, okay, and we'll give more money to the researcher, and they'll talk about how they're making big discoveries, and that was the interaction of patients with the whole product development system. But now they realize, I think there's a broad realization that they can actually drive how the whole thing comes down, okay, from actually research all the way through to the clinical development programs and what's measured and how the trials are set up and so forth. And so now we're in a much more operational phase where people are thinking, how can I do this? They're asking me all the time, City, put some guardrails in, some principles on industry engagement with patients during this. So I thought it was very good. Bray tells me there's some more documents like that out there. Patient groups want to know, okay, well, industry wants to interact with us, what should we do? How do we do this? What, works? What is beyond the pale, so to speak? What shouldn't we do? So we're beginning to develop those pathways where patients can really influence how the research system is directed. So I think that's extremely important, and we're very happy to have kind of had a part of starting that.
And and I think certainly, as FDA goes, so goes industry for sure. Some of that early work has it's energized the patient groups, it's energized
Percolated.
energy, and it's percolating all throughout the system. But the question that I have for all of you now is, several years into this, how are we doing? Are we moving fast? Are we moving slow? Are we moving fast enough? Are we learning enough to begin to devise best practices for how to continue to prioritize patient-centered engagement and improve upon it? And Bray, you're nodding your head, so you start.
Yeah, I think, so we've seen the willing who have joined and who are actively helping us contribute evidence that has been kind of codified into best practices, and that's what City's project actually did. But I think at some point we need to shift to, whether it's at your IND or NDA, when those applications go in, that it actually says, how have you engaged patients? Because unfortunately, a lot of times when my team of engagement professionals gets called in, the protocol was already designed and too many decisions were already made, and then a sponsor's not willing to back up because it would cost millions of dollars and a lot of time.
Delay. Yeah.
And so I think we really have to focus now on, building it in earlier, ensuring that there are pathways. And then, a lot of us in this field went from kind of developing the field to now the focus on implementing and teaching others and education. And so I think that really, we need to spend a lot of time. And also, truly what you said, measuring and building, continually building evidence about the true benefit and value of patient engagement.
Yeah, if I may interject. So what we're doing has more to do with medical product development, so across biologics, devices, and drugs. We're thinking, well, one of the ways we need to hear the patient voice is what is measured in trials, like what is their experience in trials. And that requires patient-reported outcome measures that you can use. And, I think we flailed around about that, and we've had a lot of problems. NIH did promise, which is very helpful. Now we've sort of landed in a direction I think is going to be very good, and we have these guidances you referred to, but we're really interested in developing a core set of measures that can be reused, tailored in different disease areas, so everybody's not going down and reinventing the wheel with Cronbach's alpha and all this kind of stuff, but actually have measures they can pick up and assemble rather easily. But there is a lot of science that has to be done there, and that's what our meetings have been. We just had a big meeting the other day about this, which I think was people are very energized, because we need to ask people not just what generally is measured is like laboratory adverse events or hospitalization adverse events, where maybe the patient will, if they're terribly vomiting or whatever, but actually understand the patient experience on this drug compared to how much the disease is alleviated from their point of view. I always tell a story, but when I came to Cedar, which was a very long time ago, in '94 at first, I'm a rheumatologist, and so a measurement they did joint counts of all the different joints and how swollen the doctor thought they were and everything. Then they measured the doctor's global. That's how the doctor felt the patient was. And I said, it doesn't really matter how the doctor feels. Right? Let's ask the person what they think about their disease at the moment. They know how long they're stiff or how much they're able to do and everything. But, so there's still a lot of that. So that's what FDA primarily, I think, is working on, and then trying to integrate into our assessment process when we get this data in, from the patient point of view, how much was the disease alleviated, and so forth and so on. So that's a big project. We have this benefit risk template, and we'll be integrating the patient point of view into that once we understand it.
I think one of the things I want to jump in and add a little bit here, and I'm going to put my research hat back on. And my research is focused on health disparities, and I think what's really important is who do we have at the table? Because we can talk about this, we can talk about these processes, but is everybody at the table? And the answer is invariably no. And the people who are experiencing disease at the most significant rates are often not at the table, because to come in to this program means that you have to be able to get to the trial, you have to get to the location, you have to understand what's going on, you have to be able to participate, you have to actually know that it exists and know that you have the opportunity to actually participate in the process, to actually be engaged in the process, and then to have, it's like that opportunity for agency. It's like there really is an agency equally across the board, and people sort of understanding like, yes, I can participate in this process. And I think making sure that when we're thinking about where we are now, and we've made great strides around listening to and understanding what the patient who gets to us when it comes to the clinical trial wants to know and wants to participate in, what their experience is. But are we really truly measuring what mattered for the person who doesn't actually get to the trial? And what do we do to engage with the communities that will bring those people to the trial who are not a part of an organization, who are not a part of a company, who are out in the community experiencing disease, experiencing the side effects, who don't even know that these opportunities exist. And so we're creating our process, our framework, our measures without them at the table. So the question is, are we really always, these measures matter, but are we measuring all of the things that truly matter to get to the solution? Because if we bring that person into a trial and we have measures that don't tap into anything about their lived experience, then they're going to step away from that trial. And we're not going to have the benefit of their knowledge. We're not going to have the benefit of their experience. And so we have to make sure that, I am a researcher by training. I am a data-driven person. I am all about the measures, but we have to really begin to think about, as we're going through this process, are we measuring what matters? Are we really engaging all of the populations that need these resources and need to have the results of these new products?
So what do we need to measure?
And that's really, we have to ask the question. We have to go out and ask the community, before we talk about the trial, before we talk about your condition, let's talk about you, and let's talk about what matters to you. One of the reasons that I feel very fortunate is because every day when we listen to calls, what a health assistant does, and this is not about this, I want to caveat this, that this is not about the company, but it's a learning experience for what we're trying to do with trials, is they're asking the question of what matters to that person. What is their lived experience? And then learning from that lived experience, because sometimes we're treating something that doesn't necessarily matter to them. And we're making things worse that that wasn't important to them. But it's understanding what that lived experience is. Storytelling is so powerful in this process. And I think patient advocates and people who have that opportunity for PCORnet to go out and hear that story and then apply that to the process is critical for us to actually make sure that the people who don't often have a voice actually have a voice.
And Ivor, you talked about getting people to the table, and then there's a question of how do you behave at the table? And I think we're still struggling with the expectations for the people we invite to the table, and then the people who have predominantly been there historically. How do they behave? You know, what we're accustomed to in terms of how we interact with each other as scientists doesn't translate necessarily to a patient-partnered process that's effective. So the timelines may not work, the levels of respect may not apply. It's just there's so many cultural complications about we can get them to the table, and then how do we behave when we're there?
Wonderful, 100%. This is so wonderful. So having been a part of CTSA and being part of the patient engagement process for CTSA, both here in Washington, D.C. and in Seattle, Washington, where I currently live, one of the things that was really unique is that we said we're going to bring them to the table and we're going to educate people about the process. And that is important because there is a level of education that needs to happen to help. If we want people to be peers at the table, there has to be a level setting of understanding. But our mindset was we need to educate them about our research process so that they can be engaged in our research process. Well, hold on a minute. What about us being educated about their process? And understanding that there's a back and forth in that process, in that learning and building that trusting relationship. And there are going to be mistakes. And I think what's really important is when you come to that table, actually when you go out into the community, when you go out and you reach out and say, hey, I want to learn from you, you have to let that dialogue happen back and forth, and you have to acknowledge we are going to make mistakes in this process. We are going to learn from each other, but we are not going to walk away from the table because the timeline wasn't convenient for our research study. It didn't fit quite well with that NIH grant deadline that I wanted. I'm sorry, you're going to have to push back a deadline or two. I know from experience. But I think what's really important is coming to the table with that humble sense of not just, I'm going to teach you about my process so that you can work well with my process, but that I'm going to come and I'm going to learn how I can work with you in partnership.
So at DCRI, we facilitate a lot of the interactions between sponsors, investigators, and patients. And we actually, not only do we do an orientation for the patient population, we do the coaching with the investigators and the sponsors, and then we start the meeting. Like we sit everybody down together. We, ensure that people aren't sitting around the table in suits. That we're all coming to this open-minded and as equals, but we really try to, set the tone for the group from all perspectives. And I think it's critically important. And I think also, the bigger thing we're talking about, who's at the table and how do we behave? are we going to actually make changes based on what we get back from the patient community? Because we can convene people all day, but if we don't intend to do
right.
anything with their input, there is absolutely no point of this. And I think that's where humility
box
comes
checking.
in.
Absolutely.
We've had some very successful engagements with patients, and I've also had others where the sponsor went, well, that's nice, no, we're not going to do that. And they were no, 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 no to everything the patient said. Go home, like
Yes.
just go home, not even worth our time.
If you don't
So-
realize that that's going to make your study richer and more powerful,
Yeah.
then you're doing the wrong type
It's
of
going to be a
research.
rescue later.
So at the same time, and all of that 100%, I think that all of the parties need to come into these partnerships and these discussions prepared to take and act on the input. But at the same time, there will be times when what patients most want or ask for are not feasible, not practical, maybe not possible. And I know that this has been one of the big fears among drug sponsors in figuring out how to engage with patients, because when we ask the question, what's important to you and what do you need, you're creating an expectation that you'll be able to deliver on that. And sometimes it's not going to be. And Julie, can you speak to that experience from the pharma point of view and how you handle that, and can you build relationships that can survive that and get you and your patient stakeholders to a productive place where you can find things to work on together?
You know, the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm listening to this, and I agree with everything that's been said, is that, you know, the title of this conversation is system thinking, and the system is much broader than the clinical trial process. It's even much broader than the design of the clinical trial in the first place. It goes back to the very beginning of just even understanding what the unmet needs are from the patient's point of view, from the payer's point of view, and from everybody who's involved in the system per se. So we have to broaden our aperture a little bit and think end to end, go clear to the other end for us when we put a package insert in a box and deliver it to a patient. I mean, that's also an opportunity for patient engagement. One of our cancer products has so many indications that we've had to redesign the packaging line to accommodate a 50-some page package insert. I rather doubt that's a patient experience of reward. So, you know, we've got to really be thinking stem to stern here. So that was my first point. But going back to this focus on the clinical trial construct, one of the most important resources that we've found in this are the advocacy organizations, because they're much more connected to the communities than we will ever be. They get involved in communities that don't necessarily participate in trials, but search for other information or learning from their advocacy touch points. So it's a very rich and complex resource that is part of the reason why we're understanding better how we can more effectively engage with patients, caregivers, and the advocates at that point, even in terms of identifying unmet needs. When it comes to what we do with input, you know, it is a barrier in the part of some investigators, and it's also important to understand that this is not every product, every therapeutic area. There are some areas where you couldn't possibly design a drug or a drug trial without fully embracing the process of engagement. There are others where the endpoints are very different, and, you know, probably we're not going to spend a lot of time on this in some domains. But the biggest fear that companies have is regulatory uncertainty, because that slows down the process. It can be extremely expensive to think you've got a pathway over here and then you find out you needed to do this kind of a study or design something differently. And there is a fear that introducing regulatory uncertainty in the form of voices of the patients and or patient-reported outcomes or other dimensions that matter very much to patients broadens the aperture of what has to happen before we have a filing that we can bring to the FDA. So I really credit Janet and Teresa and the FDA for creating more certainty around how this will be evaluated, what measures are validated or, you know, likely to be validated. You know, we're chipping away at reducing that regulatory uncertainty, and I think as that happens, there'll be more and more enthusiasm. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, we try to have conversations with patients that begin and end with we're we're all here to learn. We're going to take your input and respect and appreciate it. That doesn't mean that we're always going to be able to accommodate it, or that everything that you value is going to be reflected in our next clinical trial. But we're committed to being transparent about that, and if we can't do it, we'll explain why. So I think there's kind of a maturation of respect that has to go on in the process.
Right.
I think that's key, like the good communication and transparency. But even, so let's say you got a phase 3 trial and we're engaging patients. We know we're not going to change the clinical endpoints because they're established in that field. We're not going to create a new validated measure by the time this trial gets off the ground. But in the how might we, instead of the no, let's think about how might we do this. Can we add, an exploratory endpoint?
Learn.
The regulatory uncertainty is one thing, but what we're seeing is really a regulatory flexibility. And that, in my experience, when sponsors have approached the FDA with patient experience data, we have seen the needle move and willingness to try something new. So they're not going to abandon the clinical endpoints that are existing. But I think there's again, how might we try new things? And then maybe this will inform, our pipeline and the trials in the pipeline in the future.
Sure, and we are going to ask for audience questions in just a moment. But before we do that, Janet, I want to ask you, because I think you and Teresa Mullen have been very clear about how much you value patient engagement and how important it is to the regulatory work that you do and the development work that sponsors do. But FDA has its challenges with implementing this as well, and we hear from certain drug sponsors and occasionally from patient groups that there might be some uneven application of patient engagement principles throughout the agency. So can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of challenges you're facing with rolling this out throughout the agency, and how you're going about overcoming those challenges to make this more predictable and consistent across the division?
Well, this is a transition, don't forget. The FDA is a very large organization, the medical product centers, but even more fundamental to that, this is societal transformation. I remember the time, I remember when in Japan they wouldn't tell the patient their diagnosis if they had cancer, and they had to go to the cancer center and get cancer treatment, and nobody talked to them because they didn't want to talk to them about it. And we used to write prescriptions in Latin, and the reason was we didn't want the patient to know what they were taking. Okay, and so there was a very paternalistic medical approach, which everybody, in all best, intents. And so people grew up in that, and so the idea that people with the disease have something to contribute. No, they were the subjects, okay? Yeah. They were the patients. And so it's a cognitive revolution. So we have to change, and it's going all through society, and it will be patchy. So what we're doing, we have a template. Like I was in a meeting about it yesterday, benefit risk template, okay? Everybody has to fill it out, but of course in my usual way, I was haranguing them. You're not filling it out well enough, right? And if there's patient data, the Cures Act now says we have to put it in that benefit risk discussion, and we have to say how it played into our thinking. But of course you can do that. You can write down this and that and the other thing, and play it lip service and not have it be real. And also in many diseases, depending on the disease, the patient groups are more or less active, and some groups are more or less disorganized because of their disease, or say they have a disease that's very devastating, or they might be in the very early stages of advocacy, like the HIV people were a long time ago, and so mainly they're just yelling at everybody because, there isn't good treatment. So the patient groups are at different levels of in being able to provide input. The doctors and other scientists are at different levels of sophistication about this real engagement with the people with the disease, just like I think the rest of the society is. Now they say medical encounter should be a partnership, right? And the doctor should talk through. How often does that actually happen? Okay, so honestly.
Only at her place.
That's right. And so we're going through a transition. What we need to do is just keep pressing and view the future. And the other thing about system thinking here is that the payers, the tech assessors in Europe, okay, they require, Julie knows this very well, they want qualities, they want quality of life. They want to benefit from the patient point of view, not what the doctors or drug companies say, oh, this was the benefit. They want to hear the benefit. So the payer community can drive this if they wish. Now, the United States is in a different place for all kinds of different reasons. But we see that a rigorous need to incorporate patient-reported information into trials because of the tech assessors around the world want that information to decide whether they're going to pay or not. Right. Okay, well, there's an incentive that's getting lined up correctly. So, but their methods, in my mind, are somewhat primitive right now. You know, they were just getting a few patients here and there and this and that and the other thing. So we are trying to bring the science along of how you get representative and robust and generalizable patient input. And it's not easy, as you said, it's not easy. Not, you know, having 3 people show up and say this and that isn't representative or robust. Right. So anyway, I think it's difficult at FDA to drive that along. I'm the acting director of the Office of New Drugs that reviews all this stuff. I have been for 2 years. We're pursuing this modernization project, and I think this is definitely part of it, is how we're going to really sincerely do this and how we interact with the patient community, make sure that we're working on behalf of the people who are actually who we serve.
You know, there's also a hidden driver that I really want to put out there, because probably the thing that's helped the most inside my organization and from talking to other chief patient officers or people with similar roles, I think it's fairly universal, and that is that unlike what you might read about in the newspaper, pharmaceutical employees are not thinking about price and rebates and you know, this world of affordability. Most people have a scientific background. They get up in the morning, they care about their science, they're passionate about drug discovery, and they really want to help patients.
Right.
But they're very far removed from the patients when they're in the lab or they're doing what they do. And so by involving patients in this process, we are putting all these people back in touch with what their true inner purpose is, and what that does for morale and engagement on the employee side, how they feel about their work and the value that their work is contributing is night and day. So it really opens up the opportunity to really help be an accelerant or a catalyst of this process inside the pharmaceutical environment. I just really think that's important, because you don't see that, or most people don't see that, but that's my experience, and that's why it's been so much fun to really, you know, feed forward in this regard.
And so I think Julie is right, because like for our chemists, we have 1,000 people who regulate manufacturing, drug manufacturing, and their attitude was, well, everything has to be like perfect, right to our standards. And it's like, what is this, a life-saving drug? And these people are out there dying. No, it has to be according to our standards, right? Because they hadn't been exposed. So when we had you know, the head of that organization got a bulletin board and got people always send in their pictures and the pictures of their kids, and they have all these, and got them to meet with patients, and the same thing happened. It's like, we get it. Oh my God, of course you can do this little bit of work after approval, because it's not that important compared to this child may, you know, have life. So it is, that is a side effect kind of that has really been salutary, I think, in FDA as well.
I think I'm going to add just really quickly, because I think we're talking a lot about pharmaceuticals and drug development, and where we sit, we're doing technology development every day. So we have technologists and engineers sitting behind computers every day creating technology to help with the patient interaction, and it's moving at the speed of sound, it feels like, for me. But I think one of the things that we do as well on the technology side, because there are people who are doing that work as well, is we do that very same thing. Our technologists, every meeting we start with them listening to a story, and they get to see and understand how what they're building actually impacts a patient's experience, and that is fundamentally powerful
It is.
for helping people center themselves on what is the North Star of what we're doing here.
Exactly.
Well, now we need to do that for all of our contract divisions if we're really going to change the system.
So this is a good point to open up for some audience questions. Let's start in the front row here. Can we get a microphone up front? Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I'm Arthur Allen from Politico. I have a question. Can you, Dr. Woodcock or any of the panelists really, can you give me an example of one drug that has not been approved or that was approved with different conditions or different sort of directions in its, packaging material, I'm forgetting the term, its label, to a doctor because of patient engagement? Can you think of one drug that you don't think would be on the market if there had been patient engagement?
Well, I believe, I'm not going to talk about one drug but I can say like in the dermatology area for the psoriasis, for the atopic dermatitis, they really did 180. We had these patient-focused drug development meetings. A lot of the members came, and they realized the devastating impact some of these diseases have on people's lives. And these drugs have side effects, the biologics, for example, but we have approved them, and I think there are many other examples.
And am I remembering correctly that when Tysabri for multiple sclerosis was reintroduced to the market after it was removed, when there was an unexpected and fatal viral infection that developed, that the input from patients was a huge factor in bringing that drug back?
They just came down on us. And also there was a cancer drug a few years ago, I think for chronic myelogenous leukemia, that if you stopped taking it, you would die, but it was causing a tremendous amount of vascular problems. Okay, within 12 hours of announcing we were going to we heard from, you can't do this, you must at least. So we changed the release so that it would still be available to those people, because they had no other treatment, and they would, So this has happened multiple times. Those were more in the classic advocacy realm, whereas I think the ones I gave you on the derm were more in the very broad, okay, we get it. We get the patient experience and how devastating this is.
And we can approach these decisions before we get to the point of people banging on your door
That's right.
because they've been affected by a decision that doesn't work for them. Yeah. Let's take at least one more question here in the second row. Can we bring the mic up?
Thank you. My name is Sarah. I'm a professor at Rutgers, and I'm also a director at Blue Cross Blue Shield, so I represent the Blues. Thank you for a very engaging conversation, and I would echo your comment that I think when you're talking about patient engagement, as you reflect system, you need to engage the perspective of a payer, and I think CMS is one of the biggest payers. Talk about the employer groups. So patient engagement, I think, is one thing that every industry has not focused enough on. Mm-hmm. Empowering the members is going to really solve a lot of problems. And I actually give Merck as an example, yet still to my students and clinicians to say, this was one of the companies that really increased the awareness of osteoporosis. So increasing the awareness of conditions drives treatments, drives outcomes. What I would say to FDA is that when we are talking about clinical trials, I think what is very important is to give the members we are engaging with or who are engaging with us a good perspective from all ends. So when you are working with pharmaceutical companies developing clinical trials, you're talking specifically of that drug. There's no requirement of comparative effectiveness. Right? We don't require. We are the only country. If you go to Europe, and I often go to Europe and understand the system, the comparative effectiveness perspective is lacking. So when the members are talking about certain treatments and certain affordability aspect, there's no perspective to say these are all the other treatments that are available that could be affordable versus this new treatment, and we see this. I mean, I review drugs on a daily basis.
And is there a question pertaining
So
to
the
engagement?
question is, how do we engage members with a broader perspective when we are designing clinical trials, looking at every aspect versus just the drug treatment, and looking at the affordability and all those aspects from an employer and a payer perspective?
So you're really asking, how do you make sure that when you're designing a study, that the people who are going to have to implement the results of that study in order to really make it useful should be at the table as well, right? So if you're thinking about designing a study where you want to affect the behavior of clinicians and healthcare delivery systems and payers, then you want to activate that receptor to be ready for the signal when that study is done, right? So you need to engage those people, like patients, at the beginning of the study design process so that you are delivering a result that's going to be meaningful for the payers, for the employers, for the healthcare delivery systems, for the people who are looking at the bottom line of their health system, so that the result is meaningful and therefore implementable. And that will contract the 17-year lag of knowledge to behavior change that we have.
Yeah, but also the patient understands the perspective, right? So the patient understands when the drug gets introduced into the market, can I afford it, and is it something that is value to me?
Well, I would
versus
just-
once a day versus three
I'd
times
just
a day.
like to say,
Very quickly.
I introduced this by saying I'm a longtime critic, okay? We need to go to master protocols and platform trials that are arranged around improving the disease rather than hypothesis tests of a single intervention.
Yep.
Until we get our minds around that, because that's what the practicing community wants, that's what the patient wants. They don't want to just know what was the hypothesis for this single disease and what was the answer. They want to know what's the best treatment for me right now, which one should I start, and what path treatment policy should be followed. That's a whole different discussion.
Right,
Real
right.
world evidence, that's another panel.
We'll do that next time. For now, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a robust discussion.